friends, I'm back. I'm back with a very interesting book today. It's a bit hard to talk about because it's not a novel, there is no storyline as such, but it's not a report with hard stats and things like that as well. In fact, the exact opposite. It's about a surgeon's realization of the importance of feelings, sentiments, cultures, and values in medicine, especially in the twilight years of a human being. And yes, the author insists that we are talking about a human being and not a patient. This book, Being Mortal, by Dr. Atul Gawande. He is a medical professional. I'm sure you have heard about him already. A Harvard professor, writer, entrepreneur, social worker. He wears many hats. And he's also the CEO of the big venture all of us saw announced last year by Buffett, Bezos, and Jamie Dimon. So we are all waiting for some great innovation to come into healthcare industry in the US, which is so badly needed. And I must thank Sunanda Patkar, our family friend, who recommended this book to me. And I'm definitely very impressed with the book, and I'm going to share a few things with you today. So it's difficult to put this book in a box, first of all, because it's not a novel, it's not fiction, it's not fact. So, but the narrative builds so powerfully, and you will realize the power of the author, that it is worth reading the whole book aloud, really speaking. But don't worry, I don't intend to do that. I will stick to my under 15 minutes and presenting the book to you goals, and I am not going to read it aloud to you. The book begins with a very powerful statement. The author simply says, I learned a lot of things in the medical school, but mortality was not one of them. And this becomes the story of the author's journey of learning about mortality as a practitioner, as a surgeon, as a friend, as a son, as a member of society. And he presents this fact and his experiences to us from multiple perspectives that are really helpful to all of us as we deal with this when our near and dear ones are facing the last leg of their life journey, and none of us really are prepared to know what to do, what to say. So this book definitely will teach us a lot about that. Now, the sentences that I'm going to put in front of you today from this book, they may seem a bit random because, like I said, it's not a novel that builds from first chapter to the next. But bear with me, I promise you it will all come together wonderfully. Death is a natural event and people handled it admirably over a long period of time. And the author starts with a couple of profound observations. The experiment of making mortality a medical experience is just decades old, and the evidence is that it is failing. And another one, he says, lacking a coherent view of how people live successfully all the way to their end, we have allowed our fates to be controlled by the imperatives of medicine, technology, and strangers. So these really are the two underlying themes that we will keep going back to again and again as we look at this book. And this also hit a raw nerve personally, because I remember my own parents and their last days, and all I could do was admit them to a hospital, and I did not see either of them as they left this world. I was very inadequate. I did not know how to articulate my thoughts, and every day I have been wondering whether that is the right way for a person to leave this world. But Dr. Gawande's book gives me some insights into that. So the way this works is that the book will follow the lives of a few people and the author's engagement with them as a son, as a doctor, as a friend, as a surgeon, or overall as a human being. So he starts by saying that dying and death confronts every new doctor, and the author talks about his own early traumatic days. He had recurring nightmares in which he would find his patients in his bed at his home, their corpses, and he would panic The nightmare scene is worth reading, and while the author certainly did not mean it that way, it is more vivid than any Hollywood movie that you can think of. One of the author's earliest realizations come by meeting Alice Hobson, his wife's grandmother, and seeing her from a very healthy, happy state all the way to her death, and the insights the author gets by watching her journey. As the author engages in the journeys with Alice and many other characters that you will meet in this book, he observes that death, of course, is not a failure. Death is normal. Death may be the enemy, but it is also the natural order of things. And he confesses that he knew these truths abstractly, but not really concretely well enough to be able to digest and put them into his practice. And he quotes Sherwin Newland in his great book, How We Die. The necessity of nature's final victory was expected and accepted in generations before our own. Doctors were far more willing to recognize the signs of defeat and far less arrogant about denying them. Today, what we see is simply the efforts to prolong life, irrespective of what the condition is, what is the likelihood of recovery, is there a need for that person to live longer, and chemotherapies and surgeries and treatments and new drug combinations. We just keep going through all that. And the good question that the author poses to all of us is that what is the goal of medical effort? Is it simply to prolong life at any cost, or is there something more? And I personally, as a layman, feel a little uncomfortable with this whole discussion in the first place. Sherwin talks about victory and defeat, and it automatically sets up a confrontational tone between death and the doctor. Is that the right framing of the issue in the first place? That's what I keep wondering about often. Then the author talks about his parents, his grandfather Atul Gawande, who lived and died in a village in India, from where the author hails. His grandfather was over 100 years old, had a very, very successful life, and when the author visited him, he lived at his home with his kids, grandkids, everybody treated him with reverence. He still went about the fields or other operations of their household and business. In all probability, the whole going around was superfluous, but his children understood the need for him to do so. He needed to feel alive, he needed to feel contributing member of the family, and they never stopped him from doing that. His grandfather finally has a fall and a serious head injury. He was brought home and he fades away over next couple of days, surrounded by his family, cared for and loved for, lying there for the great leveler to come and get him. The author compares this with the American system that has developed since mid-50s last century. The nursing home, the surgery, the hospices, and overall, you can never go back home now feeling that is given to the person. And the person is just shuttling from hospital to nursing homes, never seeing his people as his life leaves him or her. And that's the real sad story that we see in this book. The author summarizes it beautifully. He says that, but in my grandfather's pre-modern world, how he wanted to live was his choice, and the family's role was to make it possible. And today, the only person who has no choice is the patient himself. The doctors and the family members decide, and there is some kind of informational approach that some doctors practice. But honestly, do you expect an 80-year-old person with mostly faculties lost or going away to understand what a doctor is saying? So it becomes oftentimes a very, very academic exercise, and mainly the doctors decide what needs to be done. So some serious learning here for all of us, patients, families and doctors. How to live was the choice, and dying was just the concluding part of living, and it was not a medical condition. And secondly, the family's responsibility was to make that possible whichever way the person wanted to die, the family was required to achieve that for him. And the medical system did not have a role in dying. It was not going to try and heal deaths. It was simply accepted death as a natural consequence of the fact that you are alive, and you just graciously welcome it as the finale of your life. But then the author muses, in contemporary societies, by contrast, old age and infirmity have gone from being a shared multi-generational responsibility to a more or less private state, something experienced largely alone or with the aid of doctors and institutions. How did this happen? How did we go from Sitaram Gawande's life to Alice Hobson's life? All of us need to think about it, and you will not find a better book to guide you on this subject. By learning from this book, we can all do a better job in one area of our life where we lack miserably. When our near and dear one is approaching the last leg of his life or her life and not keeping well, shuttling from hospital to hospital, very few people, including the doctors, know what to say to that person, what to ask that person, what facts to present to that person. And mostly the person, just like my parents, are sent to a hospital to live out their final days, which I feel, and the author says, is probably the most miserable way for them to take leave of this life, the wonderful life that they had. The author also explains to us a particular way of looking at these experiences, especially the painful ones, which is called peak and end, and is something that definitely needs to be read much more in detail in the book. So what happens is that when you face pain, you remember the peak of the pain and you remember the end of that pain. And the author is pointing out to us that the end, if we are going to make it miserable for our people, then that's all they are going to think about and remember as they take leave of this world and they take our leave. So definitely read this book. I personally found it very, very inspiring. And as usual, I am providing some links below for you to know or buy this book, see other people talking about this book, and I wish you a great read of this book, and thank you very much for watching.